Blood stained the marble floors of Rome's palace. An emperor's life ended by blades meant to silence tyranny and madness. Picture yourself standing in the shadows of the Palatine Hill on a cold January morning in 41 AD. The air carries the metallic scent of fresh blood mixing with incense from nearby temples. You can hear the distant echo of screams fading into whispers, then into the kind of silence that follows violent death. The most powerful man in the known world lies crumpled on polished stone, his purple robes darkening with crimson, 31 wounds marking the end of a reign that began with hope and ended in horror. But to understand how Rome's marble halls became a slaughterhouse, you must first see the city as it was, a magnificent paradox wrapped in power and paranoia. The Rome of 41 AD stretched across 3 continents, its legions conquering lands from Britain's misty shores to Egypt's burning sands. You would have marveled at its grandeur, the forum bustling with senators in gleaming togas, aqueducts carrying fresh mountain water to marble fountains, and amphitheaters where crowds roared for blood and spectacle. This was an empire that commanded 50 million souls, built on the backs of slaves and the brilliance of engineers who moved mountains to feed their capital's appetite. Yet beneath Rome's golden facade, something rotten festered. Walk through the Senate House, and you would have felt the weight of suspicious glances, heard conversations dying mid-sentence when footsteps approached. Trust had become a luxury few could afford. The previous emperor, Tiberius, had spent his final years as a paranoid recluse on the island of Capri, sending death warrants to Rome like other men sent letters. His reign had taught the nobility a cruel lesson. Survival required masks, and authenticity could be fatal. You see, the Julio-Claudian dynasty was haunted by its own success. Augustus had established an empire so vast that holding it together required absolute authority. But absolute authority in human hands inevitably corrupted. Each succession brought fresh bloodshed as family members eliminated potential rivals. Brothers murdered brothers, mothers poisoned sons. The purple of imperial robes had been dyed red with family blood for decades. Into this world of glittering brutality was born Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, though history would remember him by a nickname that started as affection and ended as a curse: Caligula. Little Boots. When you hear that name whispered in Rome's shadows, it carries the weight of a nightmare made flesh, a cautionary tale about what happens when unlimited power meets a mind shattered by trauma. Imagine the child Caligula might have been, born into privilege, heir to a legacy of conquest, surrounded by the finest tutors and the most beautiful art the ancient world could offer. His father, Germanicus, was beloved by both soldiers and citizens, a military genius who could have claimed the throne but chose loyalty to the empire over personal ambition. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, descended from Augustus himself, carrying the blood of gods and heroes in her veins. But you must understand that in Rome's imperial family, love was dangerous and trust was death. The boy who wore little soldier's boots in German military camps witnessed horrors that would break most adult minds. He watched his father die under suspicious circumstances, possibly poisoned by political rivals. He saw his mother and brothers destroyed by Tiberius's paranoia, their names erased from public records as if they had never existed. By the time Caligula reached the throne at 24, he had learned that survival required becoming someone else entirely. The laughing child who had charmed soldiers with his miniature uniform had transformed into something else. A master of deception who could smile while planning murder, who could speak of mercy while ordering executions. The Roman people, desperate for relief from Tiberius's oppressive final years, initially welcomed their new emperor with unprecedented joy. They saw in Caligula the return of his father's bloodline, the promise of a golden age restored. They couldn't see the psychological fractures hidden beneath his charming exterior, couldn't imagine that their savior carried within him the seeds of their own terror. You must grasp this fundamental truth about power in ancient Rome. It existed without meaningful restraints. No constitution limited an emperor's authority. No independent judiciary could challenge his decisions. The Senate, once the voice of Republican virtue, had been reduced to a collection of frightened yes-men who competed to praise their ruler's wisdom while planning his destruction. In this system, an emperor's character was the only check on his authority, and character, as you'll discover, can shatter under the right pressures. What followed Caligula's ascension was not merely the story of one man's descent into madness, but a revelation of humanity's capacity for both worship and destruction. The same crowds who cheered his generosity would eventually whisper prayers for his death. The same senators who praised his wisdom would sharpen their daggers in secret meetings. The same system that elevated him to godlike status would ultimately demand his blood to restore its balance. As you prepare to journey through the darkness of Caligula's reign, remember that you're not simply observing ancient history. You're witnessing the eternal human struggle between power and conscience, between the desire to be loved and the temptation to be feared. Every decision that led to those blood-stained marble floors began with a choice, and every choice revealed something essential about the nature of absolute authority. The shadows are gathering on the Palatine Hill, and the stage is set for a tragedy that will echo through centuries. But first, you must meet the boy who would become the monster, the child whose little boots would one day march through rivers of Roman blood. How does innocence transform into cruelty when power removes every boundary that once defined humanity? Born into privilege, raised among whispers of betrayal, Caligula's childhood was steeped in both imperial promise and unspeakable trauma. You need to understand that Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus entered the world not in Rome's marble palaces, but in the harsh Germanic frontier, a place where survival meant strength and weakness invited death. The year was 12 AD, and his first cries mixed with the sounds of Roman legions preparing for another day of conquest. Even as an infant, he breathed air thick with the smoke of military campfires and the metallic tang of weapons being sharpened for battle. Picture his father, Germanicus, standing over the newborn's cradle in a leather campaign tent. Here was Rome's golden prince, handsome, brilliant, beloved by soldiers who would have followed him into the underworld itself. Germanicus possessed that rare combination of military genius and moral integrity that made enemies respect him and allies worship him. When he held his son, he saw the future of Rome itself, another generation to carry forward the family's legacy of honor and service. But you must see beyond this moment of paternal pride to understand the poison already seeping into young Gaius's world. Even as Germanicus planned campaigns and dreamed of his son's future, political enemies in Rome were spinning webs of conspiracy. The imperial court had become a place where affection was suspicious, loyalty was dangerous, and family bonds were viewed as potential threats to the emperor's security. The boy's earliest memories were forged in military camps along the Rhine, where hardened veterans taught him to march before he could properly walk. Imagine the sight that earned him his famous nickname, a tiny figure in miniature military uniform, complete with soldier's boots crafted by the legion's leather workers. Caligula, Little Boots, the soldiers called him, and their laughter was genuine, filled with the rough affection of men who missed their own children. You can almost hear the sounds that shaped his young mind, the rhythmic tramp of marching feet, the clash of training weapons, the evening songs of soldiers sharing wine and stories around flickering fires. These were good men, mostly, farmers and craftsmen transformed into the empire's iron backbone. They loved their general's son with the fierce protectiveness of warriors who understood that innocence was precious precisely because it was so fragile in their brutal world. But even in this cocoon of military protection, shadows were gathering. Young Caligula witnessed scenes that no child should see. Enemy prisoners brought before his father for questioning, their faces marked by torture and defeat. He watched executions carried out with military efficiency, learned that death was often the price of defiance. Most children his age played with wooden toys. He played with real daggers gifted by doting soldiers, learning to handle weapons before he learned to read properly. The psychological seeds of what he would become were planted in these early years, though you wouldn't have recognized them then. Watch him carefully as he observes his father's interactions with subordinates. How a word of praise could transform a man's entire bearing. How a gesture of displeasure could reduce a veteran to trembling submission. He was learning the intoxicating mathematics of power, how emotions could be weapons, how fear and love were often indistinguishable in their effects. When Caligula was 7, the idol of military camp life shattered. Germanicus received orders to return to Rome, then to lead campaigns in the east. The boy found himself thrust into the viper's nest of imperial politics, where every smile concealed a potential blade, and every kindness carried the possibility of poison. You must understand the suffocating atmosphere of Tiberius's court. The emperor, Augustus's stepson and chosen heir, ruled with increasing paranoia and cruelty. He saw conspiracies everywhere, and in many cases he was right. Power in Rome attracted ambition, like honey attracted flies. But his solutions were always the same: elimination, exile, or execution. The court lived under a perpetual sword of Damocles, where today's favorite could become tomorrow's corpse. For young Caligula, this meant learning to wear masks. The cheerful, open-hearted child of the Germanic camps had to disappear, replaced by someone more careful, more calculating. He watched his beloved father navigate these treacherous waters, trying to serve Rome while protecting his family from political predators. But even Germanicus's skill and popularity couldn't shield them from what was coming. The boy was barely 8 when his father died in Syria, officially from illness, though whispers of poison followed the news back to Rome like a plague. Imagine Caligula's world suddenly tilting on its axis. The man who had been his model of strength and honor, his protection against the empire's cruelties, was gone, and with Germanicus's death, the family's enemies finally had their opening. What followed was a masterclass in political destruction. His mother, Agrippina, tried to seek justice for her husband's suspicious death, but her investigations were seen as accusations against Tiberius's competence. The emperor, never tolerant of criticism, began to view the entire family as a threat to his reign's stability. You can almost feel the walls closing in around the boy as he watched his family systematically destroyed. His mother was banished to a barren island, where she would eventually starve herself to death rather than give her enemies the satisfaction of a public execution. His older brothers, Nero and Drusus, were arrested on fabricated charges of treason, imprisoned in conditions so harsh that they too would die, one by starvation, the other possibly by suicide. Through all of this, young Caligula had to survive by becoming invisible. He learned to suppress his grief, his rage, his natural reactions to the horror unfolding around him. In the imperial court, showing emotion was showing weakness, and weakness invited predation. So he smiled when expected to smile, remained silent when silence was demanded, and buried his true feelings so deep that perhaps even he began to forget where he had hidden them. The trauma of these years was not just the loss of family. It was the lesson that love made you vulnerable, that caring about others gave enemies weapons to use against you. He learned that survival required a kind of emotional amputation, cutting away the parts of himself that could feel pain or form genuine attachments. By his teenage years, Caligula had become what the court required, a charming, seemingly harmless young prince who posed no threat to anyone's ambitions. He was witty without being cutting, intelligent without being threatening, pleasant without forming deep friendships. It was a perfect performance, and it kept him alive when being a member of his family had become a death sentence. But you must understand that this survival came at a cost. Every genuine emotion he suppressed, every natural reaction he stifled, every moment of authentic feeling he sacrificed to political necessity, all of these created psychological wounds that never properly healed. They festered in the darkness of his mind, growing more toxic with each passing year. The boy who had once laughed with soldiers and played war games with wooden swords was transforming into something else entirely. The little boots that had once symbolized innocent childhood were now carrying him down a path toward a throne and toward a reckoning that would drench Rome itself in blood. Who was the real Caligula beneath the masks he had learned to wear, and could that buried child ever truly die? Before the throne, Caligula learned death's language: family murdered, mother exiled, siblings starved, Rome's cruelty etched into his soul. You must witness the moment when childhood dies forever. Picture 13-year-old Caligula standing in the shadows of a marble corridor, his small frame pressed against cold stone as he watches his brother Nero being dragged away in chains. The metal links scrape against the polished floor with a sound like grinding teeth, and you can see in the boy's eyes the exact instant when his last illusions about safety and family loyalty crumble into dust. This was not a gentle introduction to loss. This was baptism by blood, education through terror. Rome had become a theater of cruelty where the imperial family provided both the audience and the entertainment, never knowing which role they might be forced to play next. Feel the suffocating weight of the palace air as young Caligula navigated halls that had become hunting grounds. Every footstep echoed with potential menace. Every conversation could be your last. The servants who had once smiled warmly now averted their eyes, understanding that association with the marked family of Germanicus was a death sentence waiting to be pronounced. Imagine the psychological torment of watching your family systematically destroyed while being powerless to intervene. Caligula's brother Drusus had been the family's hope, intelligent, charismatic, possessing their father's natural leadership abilities. But intelligence in Tiberius's Rome was often viewed as cunning, and charisma was seen as the dangerous quality of potential usurpers. The boy learned to measure time not in days or months, but in the intervals between arrests. First, Nero, accused of plotting against the emperor with evidence so fabricated that even hardened senators whispered doubts in private. Then Drusus, charged with similar crimes after making the fatal mistake of publicly defending his brother's innocence. You need to understand what it meant to be disappeared in imperial Rome. These weren't clean executions that granted the dignity of a quick death. The accused were thrown into underground chambers beneath the Palatine Hill, where darkness was absolute and hope died slowly. They were fed just enough to prevent quick starvation, given just enough water to prolong their suffering, kept alive long enough to serve as examples of what happened to those who displeased Caesar. Picture Caligula lying awake at night, staring at ceiling frescoes that depicted mythological scenes of gods and heroes, while knowing that floors below, his brothers were slowly dying in conditions that would have shocked barbarians. The palace that should have been his sanctuary had become his prison, decor, aided with beautiful lies while housing unspeakable truths. His mother, Agrippina, fought with the fierce desperation of a lioness protecting her remaining cubs. But you must see how her very courage became another weapon used against her family. Every petition she filed, every senator she approached, every public appearance where she maintained her dignity despite her grief, all of these were twisted into evidence of sedition, proof that she was rallying opposition to Tiberius's rule. The emperor's paranoia had reached pathological levels by this point. He saw conspiracy in every gathering, treason in every private conversation, rebellion in every family dinner he wasn't invited to attend. Agrippina's refusal to quietly accept her husband's suspicious death and her son's imprisonments was viewed not as natural maternal grief, but as dangerous political activism. Watch young Caligula's face as he witnessed his mother's final public appearance before her exile. She stood before the Senate with her head high, her voice steady as she spoke of justice and family honor. But you could see in her eyes the knowledge that she was signing her own death warrant with every word, and in her son's face you could see something else dying, his faith in the possibility that good could triumph over evil, that truth could overcome political necessity. The exile itself was crafted as psychological torture. Agrippina was banished to Pandataria, a barren island where Augustus had once exiled his own daughter for adultery. The message was clear. This was where inconvenient women were sent to disappear from history. The island offered no comfort, no society, no hope of return, only endless days of contemplating how imperial favor could transform into imperial fury. For Caligula, his mother's exile meant the final severing of his last emotional anchor. She who had been his protection, his source of strength, his reminder that their family had once stood for honor and service. She was now beyond his reach, dying slowly under the Mediterranean sun, while he remained trapped in the palace that had consumed everything he loved. But perhaps the cruelest lesson came in watching how quickly Rome adapted to these tragedies. The same senators who had praised Germanicus now spoke his name only in whispers, if at all. The same citizens who had cheered for Agrippina's family now turned their faces away when the surviving son walked through the forum. Political expedience demanded collective amnesia, and Rome was always eager to forget inconvenient truths. You can almost hear the internal voice that began speaking to Caligula during these dark years, a whisper that questioned everything he had been taught about loyalty, love, and human decency. If family bonds meant nothing when power was at stake, what did? If honor and service were rewarded with destruction, what was their value? If the crowd that cheered today could abandon you tomorrow, why should their opinion matter? The psychological transformation was subtle but profound. The boy learned to compartmentalize his emotions, storing grief and rage in sealed chambers of his mind where they couldn't betray him through facial expressions or unguarded words. He developed an almost supernatural ability to read people's true intentions beneath their diplomatic language, understanding that survival required constant vigilance against betrayal. Most dangerously, he began to internalize the power dynamics he witnessed daily. He saw how fear could be more effective than love, how unpredictability could be more useful than consistency, how isolation could be safer than trust. These lessons were being carved into his developing personality like words etched in stone, permanent, foundational, and ultimately destructive. By his 15th birthday, Caligula had become a master of performance. He would project exactly the image required by any situation, harmless when harmlessness was needed, charming when charm would serve him, invisible when visibility meant danger. But this mastery came at the cost of authentic selfhood. He was becoming a collection of useful masks with no fixed identity beneath them. The final psychological blow came with news of his family's deaths. First Nero, who died after years of imprisonment under conditions so harsh that death became mercy. Then Drusus, who lasted slightly longer but met the same inevitable end. Finally, their mother, who chose starvation over surrender, dying on her barren island rather than giving Tiberius the satisfaction of public submission. When the last of these deaths was confirmed, something fundamental shifted in young Caligula's mind. The family that had defined his identity, the love that had anchored his humanity, the hope that had sustained him through years of political terror, all of it was gone. What remained was a teenage boy who had learned that power was the only reality that mattered, and that those who possessed it could reshape truth itself to serve their purposes. Standing alone in the palace that had devoured his family, surrounded by the same marble beauty that had witnessed their destruction, Caligula faced a choice that would define not just his future, but Rome's destiny. Would he honor their memory by somehow maintaining their values, or would he embrace the harsh lessons their deaths had taught about the true nature of imperial power? In the end, survival itself had become his only remaining family loyalty, and survival, as he had learned, required becoming the kind of person his father would no longer recognize. What happens to the human soul when love becomes a liability and compassion becomes a fatal weakness? The Senate cheered, the people wept with joy. Rome crowned its new emperor, Nowhere it was welcoming a nightmare. You stand among the ecstatic crowds in the Forum on March 16th, 37 AD, as news spreads like wildfire through Rome's narrow streets. Tiberius is dead. The old emperor, who had ruled through fear and isolation for over 2 decades, had finally breathed his last on the island of Capri. But more intoxicating than his death was the announcement of his successor. Young Caligula, the beloved son of Germanicus, would ascend to the purple throne. Feel the electric anticipation crackling through the air as citizens abandoned their shops and homes to flood the streets in celebration. You can hear their voices rising in a crescendo of hope. The Golden Prince returns. Germanicus lives again in his son. Rome's savior has come. These people had endured years of oppressive taxes, arbitrary executions, and imperial paranoia. In Caligula, they saw deliverance, the restoration of a dynasty they had loved and mourned. But you must understand the profound irony unfolding before your eyes. The same crowd that cheered so rapturously had no idea they were celebrating the rise of a man whose soul had been systematically destroyed by the very system they hoped he would reform. They saw the charming exterior he had perfected through years of survival, but they could not see the psychological wasteland that lay beneath. Watch 24-year-old Caligula as he makes his first public appearance as emperor. His bearing is perfect, dignified but approachable, confident but not arrogant. When he speaks of honoring his father's memory and serving Rome's people, his voice carries just the right mixture of gravitas and warmth. It is a masterful performance, and it is entirely calculated. You need to see past this theatrical perfection to understand what was really happening in that moment. Here was a young man who had spent his formative years learning that authentic emotion was dangerous, that genuine relationships were liabilities, that survival required constant deception. The skills that had kept him alive in Tiberius's court were now the tools he would use to rule an empire. The early months of his reign seemed to validate every hope the Roman people had invested in him. Picture the scenes of unprecedented generosity that unfolded across the city. Caligula distributed bonuses to the Praetorian Guard that were 4 times larger than traditional amounts. He recalled political exiles from their barren islands, restoring their citizenship and dignity. He staged gladiatorial games so lavish that the crowds gasped in amazement at their scale and spectacle. But you must look deeper than these popular gestures to understand their true purpose. Every act of generosity was carefully calculated to build loyalty and establish his reputation as a benevolent ruler. The bonuses to the guards bought their devotion to his person rather than to the empire. The recalled exiles became grateful allies who owed their freedom to his mercy. The games demonstrated his power to provide entertainment that previous emperors had been too miserly to fund. Most telling of all was his treatment of Tiberius's memory. While privately he must have felt some gratitude toward the man who had spared his life when his family was destroyed, publicly Caligula positioned himself as the antithesis of his predecessor's cruel rule. He spoke of transparency where Tiberius had cultivated mystery, of accessibility where the old emperor had chosen isolation, of mercy where his predecessor had dispensed only justice tempered by paranoia. You can almost see the psychological satisfaction this gave him, not just the pleasure of popular adoration, but the deeper satisfaction of rewriting the narrative of his own survival. Instead of being the frightened boy who had lived by making himself invisible, he was the golden prince who had endured suffering to return and save Rome from tyranny. The Senate, which had been reduced to a collection of terrified yes-men under Tiberius, initially embraced their new emperor with genuine relief. Here, finally, was someone young enough to be molded by their counsel, someone who spoke of partnership rather than domination. In their first sessions together, Caligula displayed an impressive knowledge of law and precedent, consulting their opinions and deferring to their expertise in ways that made them feel relevant again. But if you watched carefully during these early Senate meetings, you might have noticed subtle signs of what was to come. When senators offered advice that conflicted with his preferences, Caligula's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. When they debated too long over proposals he favored, his fingers drummed silently against his chair's armrest in a rhythm that suggested barely controlled impatience. The transformation began so gradually that most observers missed it entirely. It started with small things. A senator who contradicted him publicly would find his proposals mysteriously delayed in committee. A critic who spoke too freely at dinner parties would discover that invitations to important social gatherings had stopped arriving. Nothing dramatic enough to cause alarm, but consistent enough to establish a pattern that perceptive observers began to notice. You must understand that Caligula's childhood trauma had taught him to view all relationships through the lens of power dynamics. Love, as he had learned, was temporary and dangerous. Loyalty was conditional and could be withdrawn without warning. But fear was reliable. Fear was honest. Fear told you exactly where you stood and what you could expect from others. The first major test of his reign came when illness struck him down just 8 months after his ascension. The fever was severe enough that Pallas Physicians feared for his life, and Rome held its breath as their beloved young emperor battled death behind closed doors. When he finally recovered, something had fundamentally changed. Whether the illness damaged his mind directly, or whether it simply provided the final psychological trigger for transformations that had been building for years, became a subject of endless historical debate. But you can see the effects clearly enough in his behavior afterward. The careful balance he had maintained between gratitude for support and suspicion of motives began to tip decisively toward paranoia. Picture the scene when he returned to the Senate for the first time after his recovery. The senators rose as one to welcome him back, their relief genuine and their applause heartfelt. But instead of the gracious acknowledgment they expected, Caligula's eyes swept the room with new calculation. Who among them had seemed too eager for news of his condition? Which ones had met privately while he was ill? What plans might they have made in case he died? The seeds of tyranny that had been planted in his traumatic childhood were finally beginning to sprout. The boy who had learned to survive by reading people's hidden intentions was now emperor, with the power to act on every suspicious thought that crossed his mind. The young man who had been taught that emotional attachments were liabilities was now in a position where he could eliminate anything that made him feel vulnerable. You can almost hear the internal voice that had sustained him through years of political terror now whispering new possibilities. If senators could not be trusted with his illness, how could they be trusted with his policies? If Rome's people loved him now, what would happen when their affection inevitably cooled? If power was the only thing that truly mattered, why not use it to reshape reality itself, according to his will? The crowd that had cheered his ascension was about to discover that they had not crowned a foe, savior, but had instead unleashed something far more dangerous than the paranoid isolation they had endured under Tiberius. They had given absolute power to a man who had learned that love was weakness, trust was folly, and survival required the complete subjugation of everyone around him. The Golden Prince was about to remove his mask, and Rome was about to learn what monsters looked like when they wore the purple robes of imperial authority. What happens when a nation places its hopes in someone who has forgotten how to hope for anything but his own survival?